Once upon a time, Venice Beach was where America went to reinvent itself. Beatniks, bodybuilders, skaters, artists, and tourists all collided in one long stretch of California sunlight and called it something like magic. That story is a lot more complicated now. This is inside the downfall of Venice Beach, a tourist trap losing visitors. What Abbot Kinney actually built. To understand what Venice Beach has lost, you have to start with what it was supposed to be. Venice was founded by Abbot Kinney in 1905 as a seaside resort town, 14 miles west of Los Angeles. Kinney was a tobacco millionaire. He had made his fortune selling Sweet Caporal cigarettes, who saw in the California coastline an opportunity to build something genuinely remarkable. His model was Venice, Italy, complete with canals, gondolas, Venetian architecture, and the cultural prestige associated with Renaissance Europe. His vision was a place where people would come to relax and enjoy the ocean air while following intellectual pursuits. After opening, Kinney brought in professors and writers to deliver lectures to what he thought would be well-attended seminars. Much to his dismay, the idea flopped. It turned out people were much more interested in carnival rides and sideshow attractions than in lectures about Renaissance painting. This is a lesson that has been relearned by well-intentioned cultural entrepreneurs repeatedly across American history. Give people the opportunity for uplift, and a significant majority will choose cotton candy. 6 blocks inland from the boardwalk, the Venice Canal Historic District is what remains of Abbot Kinney's original Italian vision. 6 canals with arched pedestrian bridges still exist, lined with some of the most expensive homes in Los Angeles. What was once a working canal system used for transportation, gondolas moved people through the waterways in the early years, and small boats carried goods, is now a scenic residential amenity surrounded by multi-million-dollar properties. The canals that survived are the ones that were built slightly south of Kinney's original plan, in what was called the Short Line Canal Subdivision. Kinney's own canals were filled in by the city of Los Angeles in 1929 to make roads. The irony is hard to miss. The original Venice of America was built on canals that were then destroyed to accommodate cars. A remnant of that vision survived and is now one of the most desirable residential locations in all of Southern California, home to houses selling for $5 million and up, bought by the same tech industry wealth that displaced the artists from the boardwalk. The canals that Kinney dug to bring people together now separate the wealthy homeowners who live along them from the chaotic, struggling public boardwalk a few blocks west. That 5-block gap, quiet, expensive canal district on one side, chaotic boardwalk on the other, is Venice Beach's central contradiction in physical form. When Venice of America opened on July 4, 1905, Kinney had dug several miles of canals to drain the marshes for his residential area, built a 1,200-foot-long pier with an auditorium, ship restaurant, and dance hall, constructed a hot saltwater plunge, and built a block-long arcaded business street with Venetian architecture. Mule teams had begun excavation work on the canals in 1904, with steam shovels brought in later to speed the work. The town drew 50,000 to 150,000 tourists on weekends. That's an extraordinary number for 1905 California, and it tells you something about the place's immediate appeal. Venice was spectacle. It was ambitious. It was slightly ridiculous in the best possible American way. A tobacco millionaire had decided to build Italy on a California swamp, and the public responded by showing up by the tens of thousands. On November 4, 1920, Abbot Kinney died, leaving his eldest son to take over the business. 1 month later, his amusement pier burned to the ground. It was rebuilt, but in 1924, the pier suffered another devastating fire that destroyed the entire complex. By 1925, Venice's politics became unmanageable. The roads, water, and sewage systems were in need of much repair. That same year, Venice was annexed to Los Angeles through a special election. The city of Los Angeles began to dismantle the amusement industry that Venice was known for. It removed the miniature railroad and filled the majority of the canals to accommodate increased automobile traffic. In 1929, oil was discovered, and within 2 years, 450 oil wells covered the area. The drilling waste clogged the remaining waterways. The city of Los Angeles had neglected Venice so long that by the 1950s, it had become known as the Slum of the Sea. Slum of the Sea was not a good start. But Venice Beach didn't stay down. The cultural golden age nobody planned. From its own ashes, Venice Beach did what it has always done when the establishment fails it. It reinvented itself from the bottom up. The bodybuilding culture that emerged in the 1950s was the first sign of the new Venice taking shape. The original Muscle Beach had actually been located in Santa Monica and inspired a culture of outdoor fitness, weightlifting, physique contests, and gymnastics across Southern California. When that Santa Monica location closed, the culture migrated south to Venice in the early 1950s, and what emerged was something more than a gym. It was a community, a performance, and a statement that the human body, shaped and developed through dedicated effort, could itself be a form of art. In the 1960s, the beatniks, followed by the hippies, migrated to Venice. Cheap rent and a vibe of individuality fed a culture of artists, musicians, and poets. Famously, the Doors formed in Venice in the late 1960s and were a staple around the Venice and Santa Monica area. Jim Morrison lived in a small apartment on Rothdale Trail, near the Venice canals. The poet and mystic who would eventually sell millions of records and become one of rock music's most iconic figures was, for a period, just another guy in Venice paying low rent and writing poetry in a place that asked nothing of him except that he be interesting. The counterculture era wasn't just about music. Venice Beach became one of the key locations where American bohemian identity was written in real time. Writers, painters, performance artists, political activists, all of them found in Venice the same thing Kinney's original visitors had found, a place that didn't take itself entirely seriously, and therefore left room for people to take themselves very seriously indeed. The city lights adjacent poetry culture of the 1950s and 1960s produced a generation of work shaped in part by the particular freedom of Venice's low-cost, high-eccentricity environment. The Venice Skate Park site is next to the original Dogtown spot where modern skateboarding was invented in the 1970s by the Z-Boys. The Z-Boys, the group of young skateboarders from the Zephyr competition team who transformed the sport from a novelty into an art form, didn't just change skating, they changed how the entire world thought about youth culture, creative identity, and what it meant to take an urban landscape and reimagine it as a canvas. That happened in Venice, in a dry swimming pool in a neighborhood that the city of Los Angeles had essentially written off. Muscle Beach, the outdoor weight pen at 1800 Oceanfront Walk, was the birthplace of the modern fitness culture. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Franco Columbu, Lou Ferrigno, and Frank Zane all trained there. When Schwarzenegger was lifting iron on the sand in the 1970s, he wasn't just building his physique, he was building the entire global fitness industry's mythology around a specific patch of Venice real estate. The image of massive bronzed athletes working out in the open sun, while tourists gawked from the boardwalk, was genuinely novel. It was free entertainment that money couldn't have manufactured. The boardwalk by the 1980s was a legitimate ecosystem of weirdness. Street performers of all types, portrait artists, fortune tellers, roller skaters in bikinis, musicians, political orators, and hucksters of every description packed the 2.5-mile stretch of Oceanfront Walk. The boardwalk drew an estimated 10 million visitors annually at its peak, making it the biggest tourist attraction in Los Angeles and second in Southern California, only to Disneyland. That's not a modest claim. That's a real number that reflects how powerfully the boardwalk culture had taken hold. The tech money arrives. The 1990s and 2000s brought a different kind of transformation to Venice Beach, slower and less visible than the skateboard revolution, but ultimately more disruptive to the neighborhood's character. Through the first decade of the 2000s, Venice continued to go through changes. A large influx of tech companies drove up real estate prices in the area, and there was a constant dialogue about what was happening to Venice's cultural roots. As the 2010s got rolling, a new and larger wave of tech companies made Venice their home. Most notably, Google and Snap showed up and set up shop. Snap Inc., the parent company of Snapchat, established its headquarters in Venice. Google opened a major satellite office. Other tech and media companies followed. The area began to be referred to in the press as Silicon Beach. One side effect of thousands of techies moving to the area was that landlords could now charge dramatically more for rent. That sentence carries the weight of an entire neighborhood's transformation. When Google and Snap established major presences in Venice in the 2000s, they didn't just bring jobs and economic activity. They brought the wage levels of Silicon Valley to a neighborhood that had built its identity on affordable weirdness. The artists and performers who had sustained Venice Beach's counterculture character for decades couldn't pay $4,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment near the boardwalk. The people who could pay that were tech workers who commuted to work on buses equipped with Wi-Fi. Venice, where tourists flock to the famous boardwalk and Muscle Beach, has been slowly shedding its historically bohemian vibe and becoming another enclave for the wealthy. Longtime residents found themselves dealing with rent increases that overwhelmed their finances. Some 80% of low-income Los Angeles renters pay over half their income toward housing costs. In Venice specifically, the situation was acute. The very affordability that had made the neighborhood a haven for artists, musicians, and bohemians for 6 decades was stripped away in less than one. The street performers, the artists, the eccentrics who had given Venice Beach its irreplaceable character, they were being quietly displaced by the same economic forces that have hollowed out bohemian neighborhoods in San Francisco, Brooklyn, Portland, and Austin. Venice Beach was the latest entry in a long catalog of American counterculture spaces that survived everything except prosperity. The Beats replaced the gondola operators. The hippies replaced the Beats, the skaters replaced the hippies, and now the tech workers were replacing everyone, not through a cultural movement, but through rent. It's difficult to see this, and a block away there's rent-controlled housing being used for hotels, said one housing advocate, describing the contradiction at Venice Beach's core. What makes the Venice gentrification story particularly sharp is the speed of it. The Z-Boys were skating Dogtown in the 1970s. Arnold Schwarzenegger was lifting at Muscle Beach through the 1970s. Jim Morrison was writing poetry in Venice in the 1960s. The counterculture identity of the place was built over decades of sustained creative energy from people who had nowhere more glamorous to go. It was dismantled in about 5 years by a real estate market responding to technology company money. The pandemic years and the encampment crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived in 2020 and applied pressure to an already stressed situation in ways that were visible from the boardwalk in a manner that had never been seen before. As COVID-19 took root in 2020, encampments of unhoused residents multiplied in California. Despite the opening of thousands of hotel beds to the homeless, under Governor Gavin Newsom's Project Room Key and Project Home Key, long rows of tents proliferated in areas of Los Angeles like Venice. With other priorities taking precedence, law enforcement agencies stopped carrying out sweeps aimed at disrupting the formation of these camps. The beachfront encampments rapidly became the latest manifestation of Venice's and LA's dysfunctional housing market. From Rose Avenue southward for about a mile, the shanties proliferated, along with the bags, boxes, bicycles, and propane and butane cooking stoves of their residents. In the alleys off the boardwalk were more encampments, and on streets a few hundred yards inland, additional encampments lined the sidewalks, abandoned lots, and industrial parking areas. The scale of what happened to Venice Beach's boardwalk during the pandemic period was genuinely shocking. This was not a gradual increase in visible homelessness. It was a rapid, dramatic transformation of a public space that millions of people visited annually into an extended encampment that tourists and locals alike described as difficult or impossible to navigate. Families who had been visiting the boardwalk for decades stopped coming. Hotels near the boardwalk reported drops in occupancy. Businesses along oceanfront walk saw foot traffic collapse. The images that circulated on social media during this period, mile-long stretches of tents along one of the most photographed coastlines in America, became a kind of shorthand for everything that was going wrong in California's approach to housing and homelessness. Of the more than 35,000 residents of Venice, nearly 2,000 are homeless people living on the streets, according to a Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority count from January 2020, before the pandemic even began. It is one of the most depressing ratios of housed to unhoused people in the country, and that number grew significantly during 2020. Dennison says self-proclaimed liberals in the community tell her they have compassion fatigue in the face of the spiraling homelessness crisis. That phrase, compassion fatigue, captures something real about the emotional position that many Venice residents found themselves in. The progressive values that had always been part of Venice's identity came into direct conflict with the lived experience of walking past hundreds of tents every day, encountering people in mental health crises on the boardwalk, and watching the businesses and culture that had sustained the neighborhood's character struggle to survive. The political debate that emerged from this period was genuinely difficult, and it reflected a fracture in the Los Angeles Progressive Coalition. On one side were those who argued that the encampments represented a humanitarian emergency that demanded immediate housing solutions, and opposed sweeps as cruel and counterproductive. On the other were residents and business owners who argued that allowing the boardwalk to be occupied indefinitely was itself a form of cruelty to housed residents, to tourists who provided the economic activity the neighborhood depended on, and to the unhoused people living in conditions that no one should live in. The cleanup efforts and their limits. Political pressure from both residents and businesses produced action beginning in 2021, when the boardwalk encampments became a nationally visible embarrassment for Los Angeles. In response to a public outcry over safety concerns and under pressure from local businesses desperate to reclaim the boardwalk, local LA City Councilman Mike Bonin announced an ambitious multi-million-dollar plan to provide shelter to all the homeless people on the boardwalk and to send in teams of outreach workers from local nonprofits. Over a 6-week period, rooms in hotels and bridge housing around the vast city would be found for several hundred boardwalk residents. But if those tent dwellers refused to relocate, they would be swept off the boardwalk regardless. The 2021 clearings produced visible results on the boardwalk itself. The most concentrated encampments were broken up. Some people were successfully connected to housing. The boardwalk became walkable again in ways it hadn't been during the worst months of 2020 and early 2021. But the results were not permanent, and a Rand Corporation study tracking the situation provided important context. A Rand study found that after city authorities cleared encampments, there was a temporary drop in homelessness in Venice, Skid Row, and Hollywood that lasted 2 to 3 months. After that window, conditions began to creep back toward previous levels as people who had been displaced from cleared areas returned or as new arrivals filled vacated space. The pattern documented by Rand, clear an encampment, see a temporary drop, watch conditions gradually reestablish, became known informally as the whack-a-mole effect. Even though it has improved in my neighborhood, it doesn't mean the whack-a-mole approach is really making a difference, said one longtime Venice resident quoted in coverage of the Rand findings. The study also found that the number of unhoused people without any form of shelter more than doubled in Venice in 2023. An average of 46% of unhoused survey respondents said they had no shelter in 2023, up from 20% in 2021 and 2022. That means that around 400 people were living at night on the streets, unsheltered, in every sense of the word. The enforcement-only approach had a paradoxical effect. By cracking down on visible tent encampments, it created a population of even more vulnerable, unsheltered people who moved around constantly to avoid citations, but didn't have anywhere permanent to go. 57% of unhoused survey respondents in Venice said law enforcement had forced them to move in 2023. The clearing of tents was not the same thing as the clearing of homelessness. It was a rearrangement. Venice is not the only American city to have discovered that clearing the visible evidence of homelessness without addressing its underlying causes produces this outcome. But few cities have had the visibility that Venice Beach commands, so the failure has been unusually public, unusually photographed, and unusually discussed by people deciding whether they wanted to visit or not. What the boardwalk is now. The Venice Beach Boardwalk of 2024 and 2025 exists in a peculiar middle state, improved from its worst pandemic-era condition, but not restored to the version that made it the second most visited attraction in Southern California. The encampments along Oceanfront Walk itself are significantly reduced compared to 2020 and 2021. All three new political leaders, Mayor Karen Bass, Councilwoman Tracy Park, and LA County Supervisor Lindsay Horvath, assumed office and indicated that the conditions of the streets are improving. Inside safe operations have moved some residents to interim housing. 4 major encampment clearings took place in Venice during a Rand Corporation study period. One was an inside safe operation that moved 106 people to motels and provided 26 people with interim housing. The boardwalk is walkable, but the character of the experience has shifted in ways that are hard to quantify but easy to feel. The vendors, performers, and street artists who defined the boardwalk's identity for decades are still there in smaller numbers. The businesses that survived the worst years are more cautious, operating with a wariness that wasn't there before. Many of the independent shops that gave the boardwalk its particular texture, the incense sellers, the t-shirt painters, the portrait artists, were replaced during the chaos years by vacant storefronts that have been slow to fill. The tourists who come are doing so with different expectations than they would have brought in 2015, expecting something edgier, more complicated, more uncertain than the sun and spectacle version that travel guides still promote. The gap between the expectation that social media creates around Venice Beach and the actual experience of walking the boardwalk on a weekday in 2024 is wide enough to generate the disappointed reviews and social media posts that have become part of the Venice Beach story. The businesses on Abbot Kinney Boulevard, the inland strip that became a high-end shopping destination in the 2000s and 2010s, have maintained a more stable commercial environment than the oceanfront. The expensive coffee shops, boutiques, and restaurants along Abbot Kinney represent a Venice that has completed its gentrification arc and arrived at a recognizably wealthy urban neighborhood. That version of Venice is doing fine. The boardwalk version, the original Venice, the reason 10 million people used to come annually, that version is struggling to articulate who it is now. Venice should be an economic magnet for tourism, entertainment, and dining, wrote one longtime neighborhood observer, and the challenges of increased crime and homelessness must be targeted and extracted from a district or venue designed to bolster commerce and goodwill. The missing piece, the Olympics problem. Here's a telling detail about where Venice Beach stands in the hierarchy of Los Angeles' self-presentation to the world. The 2028 Summer Olympics are being organized for Los Angeles, and Venice to date is not the site of any events, according to LA 28, the organizing arm of these summer games. Consider the size and geographic location of Los Angeles and the multitude of venues that will be included. Santa Monica, the Honda Center, the Rose Bowl, a downtown sports park, and for the first time, a Valley Sports Park. The fact that nothing has been scheduled for Venice only sheds light on the current conditions that exist as unsafe and unattractive for any event. That is an extraordinary thing to observe. The boardwalk that attracted an estimated 10 million visitors per year, more than most national parks, more than many theme parks, is not considered a viable venue for any event at the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics. The organizing committee looked at the most famous stretch of beachfront in one of the world's most famous cities and decided it wasn't worth including. Beach volleyball at the Santa Monica Beach, not Venice. Open water swimming in the Pacific, not off Venice. The symbolism of that choice is hard to miss. That says something about perception, it says something about reality, and it says something about the gap between what Venice Beach was and what it has become in the minds of the people responsible for putting Los Angeles' best face forward to the world. In both cases, the FIFA World Cup in 2026 and the 2028 Summer Olympics, part of the tourist dollars that will come with sponsoring such international events is dependent upon a Venice Beach that lives up to the notion of a marquee destination, and part of a hosting process that views our beaches and amenities as first-rate and worthy of coming back. Venice Beach is not currently living up to that notion. That's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of planning documents and event scheduling. The road ahead. There are people in Venice who believe the neighborhood can recover its previous character, and there are genuine signs that some of the worst conditions of the pandemic years have been addressed. The homeless count in Los Angeles dropped 3.4% in the city and 4% countywide in the most recent available data. Enforcement of anti-camping ordinances has made the boardwalk more navigable. New council leadership has shown more consistent engagement with the problem than the previous administration. But the deeper structural issues that created Venice Beach's crisis remain unresolved. Housing affordability in Los Angeles continues to deteriorate rather than improve. The people who gave Venice its cultural character have largely been pushed out and have not been replaced. The tech companies that drove up rents and sparked the gentrification wave are not going anywhere. The fundamental causes of homelessness in Los Angeles, housing costs, mental health services, addiction treatment, the limits of what any single neighborhood can absorb, are regional and state-level problems that no amount of oceanfront walk enforcement can solve. The city of Los Angeles has spent approximately $1.5 billion annually on homelessness services in recent years, with results that have been, at minimum, modest. The money has not produced a corresponding reduction in the visible homelessness that makes Venice Beach a difficult visit for tourists and a difficult home for residents. Whether that represents a failure of the programs, a failure of implementation, or simply a reflection of how vast and structurally intractable the underlying problem is, depends on who you ask. And in Venice, people are still asking. What makes the situation particularly frustrating for Venice Beach is that its problems are structural enough to require regional solutions, but visible enough to be Venice Beach's problem in the eyes of the world. The homelessness crisis in Los Angeles County involves approximately 46,000 people, far more than any single neighborhood can address. Venice Beach happens to have one of the highest concentrations of unhoused residents relative to its size in the county, and the boardwalk happens to be one of the most visited and photographed public spaces in Southern California. These two facts in combination made Venice the face of a crisis that extends throughout the entire region. What Venice Beach is facing is not unique. Cities across America are confronting the consequences of decades of underinvestment in affordable housing, mental health care, and addiction services visible in their most public spaces. Venice Beach is simply doing it on one of the most photographed stretches of coastline in the world, where the gap between the mythology and the reality is visible to anyone with a phone. The 10 million annual visitors who once made Venice Beach the crown of Los Angeles' tourism identity have not gone to a worse place. They've largely gone to Santa Monica's 3rd Street Promenade, to Malibu, to the Pacific Palisades, to neighboring destinations that have maintained the version of Southern California leisure that Venice Beach once defined. Whether Venice Beach can reclaim that position before the 2028 Olympics opens the rest of the world's scrutiny on Los Angeles is the open question. The bones of the place are still remarkable. The beach, the light, the canals, the skate park, the boardwalk itself. The question is whether the people and the institutions responsible for managing it can build something worthy of those bones. And that is the story of Inside the Downfall of Venice Beach, a tourist trap losing visitors. If you found this look at Venice Beach worth your time, hit the like button and subscribe. We dig into the real stories behind the places that shaped American culture, and there's a lot more to cover. New videos every week.